Hello everyone, this is Dr. Prarthana, Assistant Professor, Department of Public Health Dentistry from Vinayaka Mission Sankaracharya Dental College. Today we will see about basics of research methodology. This is a big topic, so we will go in part by part. So today we will jump into the first part. So first we will see introduction, objectives of this research, research method and methodology, scientific method, types of method, researches and health research triangle, oral health research, purpose of this oral health research and research process, and the analysis, interpretation and report writing. Coming to introduction, research is the continual search for the truth using the scientific method. So it's a continuous search for a truth in a mode of scientific method. So research is the quest for knowledge through the diligent search. So we have to do diligent search for the literature for find the truth. So this is called as research. So the Advanced Learners Dictionary of Current English lays down the meaning that research is a careful investigation or an inquiry, especially through the search for new facts. According to the Clifford Woody, research comprises defining and redefining the problem, and they formulate the hypothesis, which is nothing but an assumption or suggestion, and then solution and collection, organizing and evaluating the data. Why do we all evaluate this data? To make the deductions and reaching to a conclusion. And also Stephenson in Encyclopedia of Social Science defined that the manipulation of things, concepts or symbols for the purpose of generalizing the extent, correct or verifying the knowledge. So what are the objectives of research? So we are about to start the research. So how do we start about? First we have to have a goal. So to that goal we need to know how we are going to go about. So that is known as the objective. Your objective should always be SMART. So S stands for specific, M stands for measurable, A stands for attainable, R stands for realistic and T stands for time bound. So your research should always be specific and not so vague, and it should be measurable or quantifiable. An unmeasurable research will end up in an analysis problem, and it should always be feasible or attainable. So we should not do any big researches which is actually not feasible, and it should be realistic and applicable in this real world and time bound. It should have a specific period like a 1 year or 2 year period according to which you can conduct the research. So this research is to gain familiarity with the phenomenon or to achieve new insights into it, to portray accurately the characteristics of a particular individual, situation or a group. It also has to determine the frequency with which something occurs or with which it is associated with something else. And why do we do all this research? To test the hypothesis of causal relationship between variable. We'll come into what this causal relationship or variable in near future. So for now, hypothesis is just an assumption. We have an assumption that this will happen in this real world and we are about to test it. So this is called as research. So basically we have come across two terms, research method and research methodology. There is a slight difference between these two. So firstly, the meaning of these two. Research method implies the method employed by the researcher to conduct the research, but methodology signifies the way to efficiently solve a research problem. And research method is a behavior and instrument used for the selection and construction of a research technique, and research methodology is the science of understanding how research is performed methodologically. And research method is carrying out experiment, test, survey, while research methodology study different technique which can be utilized in the performance of experiment, test and survey and so on. So which means research method is the outline. Research methodology is the scientific way we attain that method. So first, this research method or methodology forms a scientific format, which is nothing but a structural organized format. So according to Carl Person, the scientific method is one and same in the branches of science, and that method is the method of all logically trained minds. The utility of all sciences consists alone in the method. So whatever it is, who sees their mutual relationship and describes their sequence. So which is nothing but you have a proper sequential manner to solve a problem. So this is the scientific method employed in a research. So scientific method based on certain basic postulates can be stated as it relies on empirical evidence, which is nothing but we need a scientific evidence, and it utilizes the relevant concepts, and it is committed to only objective consideration. Objective in the sense it should not be subjective or perceived, it should be with the evidence. It presupposes ethical neutrality, that is it aims at nothing but making only adequate and correct. So it should be always ethical, and it results in a probabilistic predictions. So we can predict if something happens on the probability basis in the end of research. And its methodology is made known to all concerned for critical scrutiny, and it aims at formulating most general axioms or what can be termed as scientific theories. So we know what is scientific research, and we have to know what are all the types of researches we can do. So basically it is basic and applied research, and descriptive analytical research, quantitative and qualitative, conceptual or empirical, and also we have some other types of research. And basically descriptive analytical means when you describe a population, it is descriptive research. Analytical, when you test a hypothesis and you have a two group and you test an hypothesis, that is analytical types of research. And it can be quantitative and qualitative based on the variable you measure. So when it is measurable, it's quantitative, and when it is not measurable in amount, it is called as qualitative. And other types of research like one-time or longitudinal research, which means it has a long follow-up period, exploratory, or it can be formalized, which is nothing but we are identifying something, or developmental research is known as exploratory research. Field setting research or laboratory researches like in vitro researches, conclusion oriented or decision oriented research, clinical or diagnostic research. So health research triangle, this you would have come across in the health. So it is actually a triangle for health and well-being, which has an intersectoral coordination of biomedical, behavioral and health service. So for research, it is similar to this health research triangle, where we need a coordination between the academia, industries and the institutions for conducting the health research. So oral health research, it is very similar, but the research refers to laboratory, clinical and field investigation which lead to the improvement of control of oral diseases and healthcare delivery, which is very much similar to the epidemiology. So what is the purpose of this oral health research? It is to promote the oral health of public by improving education, service and practice and delivery, to contribute new knowledge and re-evaluate the current knowledge, to improve all phases of oral health care, to improve the techniques and practice of identifying, preventing and treating oral diseases in individuals and in groups. And also it helps to develop and test theories related to oral health care and to identify and solve problems indigenous to the advancement decision making and change in oral health care delivery. So we know what is research and we know what are the types of research. So how do we go about it? First we have a research process. So initially start from a defining research problem and review of literature, formulate research hypothesis, design a research, collect the data, analyze the data, interpret and report. So we'll go each by each, and we have a feedback mechanism at every other step. So firstly we have problem formulation or defining a problem. Whenever we start a research, we need a question in our mind. So that is the problem formulation. A research problem is a statement or a question that poses an unknown relationship between variables and serves to focus the entire investigation. So there are two ways of stating a problem. It can be a question format or making a statement. It can be declarative statement. So we can ask whether this so-and-so or so-and-so diseases is prevalent in so-and-so population. So that will be your problem formulation, and you are about to find if that question is right or wrong at the end of the research. So what are the ideal requirements for this problem? A problem must be significant to some aspect of oral health care, and if it is solved, it should contribute to the oral health care delivery by leading to new knowledge. So when you have a question, it should have an answer. So it should be solved. Either it can be a positive solution or a negative solution, that doesn't matter, but it has to be solved so that it can contribute to the oral health care delivery. So the problem must be observable, capable of measurement through known methods of quantification. So always, as I was already said, it should be measurable so that it is easy to analyze and get a result. And the problem should be of the interest to the researcher, who must be capable of assessing the necessary resources for proper scientific investigation. So good criteria for selecting a good research problem. So as we have discussed the SMART technique, here it is another technique for research problem. Should be significant to the discipline, originality, feasibility, administrative support should be there, and peer support should be there, availability of subjects should be there, and researchers' competency should be very good, ethical considerations should be considered, no unethical practices are allowed in research, it should be solvable or researchable problem, and should be current and interesting, clear and unambiguous, empirical, verifiable, relevant and systematic. So applying a framework when developing a research problem. When you develop a research problem, this format applies for the research problem, the hypothesis and also the title of a research. So this is called as PICO, or we can call it as PICOT. So P stands for the problem or the population, I stands for the intervention, C stands for the comparison, O stands for the outcome, and T is the time measurements of the research. So population is the research in which population you are going to conduct. Intervention, what type of intervention or what type of manipulation you are planning in that population. For basic researches like descriptive researches, this intervention component will not always be there. So in that cases it can be replaced by exposure, which means the exposure of diseases. And C is the comparison group. When you give a manipulation, there should always be a comparison to analyze the data and the outcome. For example, can insensitizing primary care doctor to prescribe non-opioid painkillers significantly reduce the rate of death by drug overdose in Michigan? So this is a research question which has all the Picot formula when you see. But the T component is not involved here. So always a time duration component can be added in your Picot. And we have formulated the research question. Now we have to do a thorough literature search to find this research question had already been investigated, and we have to find the rationale for doing this research. So once the problem is formulated, a brief summary of it should be written down. And where do we find all this literature? In the primary, secondary and tertiary literature. Primary is from the original researches. So it is immediate result of research activities and often include the analysis of data collection in the field of laboratory. For example, original researches and dissertations, technical reports. Secondary literature, which will summarize and synthesize the primary literature. So it's a concise format of primary literature, which is a review. So it can be literature review, scientific, systematic reviews and books. Tertiary literature, where the summaries are condensed version of materials. So this here, secondary materials are condensed. So it is like textbook, dictionaries and encyclopedias and handbooks. So how do we write the literature? We have found the literature. Writing a literature review involves finding relevant publications, critically analyzing them and explaining what you found. So these have 5 key steps. First, search for relevant literature. Identify whichever topic is relevant to you. Evaluate the sources. Always find the sources in which it was published and then find if the sources are reliable. Identify the theme, debates and gaps. When you identify the gaps, you can find what is the literature gap which was left, and you can evaluate that in your research question. And outline the structure always and write your literature review. So hypothesis formulation. So we came with the research question, we had a literature review. Now we have to give an assumption or hypothesis. Hypotheses are carefully constructed statement about a phenomenon in the population. So the hypothesis may have been generated by deductive reasoning or based on inductive reasoning for prior observation. One of the most useful tools for health research is the generation of hypothesis. Hypothesis should be related to available technique of research. It should be related to the body of theory. It should be clear and precise, capable of testing, and it should state the relationship between the variable. It should be limited in scope and must be very specific, and should be stated as far as possible in the simple terms. So it should be considered and understandable. So there are majorly 2 types of hypothesis. There are other types of hypothesis also. First, usually in a research, we will consider these 2. Null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis or research hypothesis. So the null hypothesis is the general statement that states that there is no relationship between the 2 phenomenon or 2 characteristics or 2 variable under consideration, or that there is no association between the 2 groups, and it is denoted by H0. An alternative hypothesis or a research hypothesis is a statement that describes that there is a relationship between the 2 variables. It is denoted as H1 or HA. For example, when we state there is a relationship between smoking and lung cancer. When the statement says there is no relationship between these 2 variables, it is null hypothesis, and when the statement says there is a relationship between the 2 variables, it is called as an alternative or a research hypothesis. So now we are ready with the hypothesis. Now we have to write a protocol. Protocol is a document that explicitly states the reasoning behind and structure of the research project, and it is a draft summary indicating why and how the study will be undertaken. So why do we write it? It states the question you want to answer. It encourages you to plan the project in detail, act as a guide for all personnel involved in the project. And it's a reminder to you and your co-worker of initial structure and aim of the project, enables you to monitor the progress necessary for you to apply for any funding or ethical approval, helps in continuation of study in the original examiner manner. Preparing a research design. So we have a research question in our hand, we have literature search, and we have the hypothesis, and we are planning a protocol. Now we have to prepare the research design. How we are going to do the methodology of this research to collect the data. So the research problem have been formulated in a clear-cut terms. Researcher will be required to prepare a research design. That is, he will have to state the conceptual structure within which the research would be conducted. The preparation of such a design facilitate research to be as efficient as possible, yield a maximum information. So, but how we'll do all these? It can be achieved depending on mainly on research purpose. So we have to identify what is our research purpose. Based on the design can be modified. First, it can be explorative, it can be descriptive, it can be diagnostic, or it can be analytical or experimentation. So based on this, the research design will vary. So preparation of research design appropriate for a particular research problem involves usually the consideration of the following: the means of obtaining the information, availability and skill of the researcher and his staffs, explanation of the way in which selected means of obtaining information will be organized and the reasoning leading to the selection, the time availability for the researcher and the cost factor related to the research. So before we consider the research methodology or the research designing, we must need a population. We cannot always explore the overall population to find a result. So we need a representative population, which is nothing but a sample. So it's a part of population called the universe reference or parent population. So sampling is the process or technique of selecting that sample from the appropriate population with the appropriate and adequate characteristics and size. And what is sampling frame? Sampling frame is the total of elements of survey population redefined according to certain specification. Advantage of sampling: it reduces the cost of investigation and the time requirement and the number of persons involved, and it allows a thorough investigation of units to observations, and it helps to provide an adequate and in-depth coverage of sample units. So what are the ideal requirements of a sample? It should be efficient, representative of the reference population, and it should be measurable always, and size should be not too large, not too small. It should be enough, and it should have an adequate coverage, should be very goal oriented and feasible always, and economical and cost effective. So how do we go about this sampling process? So we have various types of sampling designs: non-probability, probability design. So non-probability is nothing but a non-random sampling. Probability is a random sampling. So random sampling, it can be simple random, systematic, stratified, cluster, or it can be multi-stage or multi-phase sampling. Non-probability can be convenient judgment or quota or snowball sampling. So first, probability sampling. What is simple random sampling? Every individual has an equal allocation to the sample. So that is a simple random sampling. Systematic random sampling is that which is similar to simple random, but every nth population is included in the study. For example, randomly I select number 4 as the first participant, the next participant will be 14, the other participant will be 24. Similarly, it will increase. And then stratified sampling. Before we said simple random and systematic random, these two are about the homogeneous population. When the population is heterogeneous and the sample is heterogeneous, we have to go about the stratified random sampling, where first initial stratification has to be done and later selection can be based on simple or systematic random sampling. And cluster random sampling. It looks very similar to stratified random sampling, but the clusters are naturally occurring. So these groups are naturally occurring, and hence we have to involve the overall population of the one cluster. Non-probability sampling or non-random sampling. First, convenience sampling. As the name suggests, it is very convenient. I involve the first person who is very convenient and near to me in the study, which is known as convenience sampling. And then purposive sampling or judgmental sampling, which is based on the judgment of the investigator. So I judge that this person will give a better result for my research. So that is called as purposive or judgmental sampling. Then the quota sampling, which is nothing but the research already predetermines that this much percentage of population will be involved in so and so group. So when a 15% quota has already been given to first group, when I have more than one also, that will not be included in my study. So that is known as quota sampling. Then snowball sampling. This is employed for a remote population where the accessibility is not happening. So as the snowball goes down, it will collect more and more snow in it. So similarly, the first person will give or a contact to the next person, and the next person contacts the next person. So that is called as a snowball sampling, and as moves, the sample increases. So we have got the sample and sampling design. We have to start the data collection. So collection of data is the demographic data comprising details of population, size, geographical distributions, etc. And such data are obtained from census surveys, like hospital records and other public services also. So data can be of two types majorly, quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative, as the name suggests, it is measurable. Qualitative, non-measurable. Quantitative can be discrete and continuous. Qualitative can be nominal and ordinal. So how do we collect these data? By primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources of data collection are observations or interview. Secondary sources are documents. And primary sources can also include the data from the questionnaires. So when we have an individual person-to-person interview, or through the questionnaires or through the observations, those are primary sources of data collection. When we have a record from the hospital records or previous history, so that is known as secondary sources of data. So first, the quantitative data, discrete is the data which is discrete or in a round number. So for example, 40 or 60, it is round, which doesn't have a decimal. So that is known as quantitative discrete data. Continuous data, as the name suggests, it is continuous or in a decimal. For example, height and weight, it can be of decimal. And qualitative are nominal and ordinal. Nominal data where both follows, there are various categorical grading, but ordinal follows an order, nominal doesn't have an order. For example, gender, male, female, it doesn't have an order, so that is nominal. But in ordinal, it can be tall, taller and tallest, which have a proper order in it. So that is why it is called as ordinal. So coming to the presentation of data, we have collected the data and we have the data. How do we present it? When we give the data we collected directly to the researcher or a statistician, it is not that applicable to the public. So always we have to present the data in an appropriate scientific manner. So presentation of data can be tabular or graphical. Tabular can be simple table, complex table. Graphical has various graphs like histograph, bar diagram, frequency polygon, line chart, pie diagram, and then map diagram and scatter plot. So first the simple and complex table. Simple table, as the name suggests, it is very simple. It has 2 cross 2 frequency table. Complex table, it has a combination of too many variables in a single table. Frequency distribution is a special type of complex table or even a simple table. It shows the distribution of in terms of frequency and percentage. So coming to the graphical representation, we have the simple bar diagram. So each bar will represent the individual variable here, and multiple bar diagrams, as the name suggests, it is multiple variables depicted in a single bar diagram. So this multiple bar diagram can either be cluster bar graph or stacked bar graph. So this is cluster or proportional bar diagram where the two variables are kept adjacent to each other, and we have a pie chart. So for example, this pie chart shows the alcohol drinking status of 391 alcohol drinking subjects under medical and ocular history in Nepal, who are vision impaired and glaucoma study, which shows 67% are social drinkers and 22% are occasional drinkers. So we have a line diagram. Majority of the quantitative variable are usually represented in this line diagram. So this line shows the population trend from 1901 to 1991, and also we have pictogram of HIV infections and AIDS. So this is nothing but a pictorial representation of early and late HIV, which will lead to the AIDS. And histogram, which is similar to bar diagram, but they don't have an interbar graph spaces here. So histogram shows the tuberculin reaction in 206 persons who were never vaccinated. So this shows the continuous variation from one point of time to the other point of time. So frequency table are always replaced by the histogram. And then frequency polygon, it shows a similar graph representation of histogram, and it is more applicable for a quantitative variable, and frequency polygon also goes hand in hand with the frequency table. Shaded ma'am, usually the distribution of certain diseases or health related events or any events in the world population is shown or represented in the shaded map. Scatter diagram, it is as the name suggests, it is scattered around a single line, which shows how much close is that dependent or independent variable to our graph. So we have collected the data, we have presented the data. With that presented data, we have to analyze and find our result, so that we'll interpret or conclude that. So it is done using the biostatistics. So statistics comes from Italian word statista, meaning statesman, or German word statistic, which means political state. So science of statistics is said to have developed from the registration of heads of families in ancient Egypt to the Roman census on military strength, birth and death, and found its application gradually in the field of health and medicine. John Grant, who was neither a physician nor a mathematician, is considered as father of health statistics. So statistics is science of compiling, classifying and tabulating the numerical data and expressing the result in mathematical or graphical form. Biostatistics is the branch of statistics concerned with mathematical facts and data related to biological events. Biostatistics is the term used when tools of statistics are applied to the data that is derived from biological sciences such as medicine. And he was the first to apply statistical method to study the human differences and inheritance of intelligence, introduced the use of questionnaires and surveys for collecting the data. So basis for statistical analysis are based on three primary entities, which is population, variable and probability distribution. So probability distribution is a way to enumerate the different values the variable can have and how frequent each value appear in a population. So it is nothing but the probability of finding a certain variable through a population. So according to this, variable can be of nature in central tendency and dispersion. So central tendency or measure of central tendency is the central value around which the other values are distributed. We have various central tendency values. Firstly, mean. As we have already known, it is an average. It implies the arithmetic average or arithmetic mean, which is obtained from summing up of all observation, dividing the total by number of observations. And it is the most common central value and most common in the quantitative variable. Median, when all the observations of variable are arranged in either ascending or descending order, the middle observation is known as median. It implies the mid value of the series. When we have two middle values, the average of two will be taken. And this is very common in the qualitative or nominal data. Mode is more frequently occurring observation in the series and most common and fashionable, such as here an example of tuberculin test for 10 boys have been given. But usually in a scientific research, especially in the health researches, mode are usually not represented. So the normal curve or normal distribution or Gaussian curve. So we see this measure of central tendency and dispersion in this normal curve. So when the data is collected from various large number of people and frequency distribution is made with a narrow class interval, the resulting curve is smooth and symmetrical, and that is called as a normal curve. So this is a normal curve. The central value is the mean, and the positive 1, positive 2, positive 3, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3 are nothing but the measures of central tendency where the values will be varied. So usually it is the standard deviation, first standard deviation, second standard deviation, then third standard deviation. The first deviation constitutes the 68% of population, second standard deviation constitutes 95% of population, and third standard deviation constitutes of 99% of population, and rest 2.5 on both sides are left as an error in the result. Coming to the measures of dispersion, it is the degree of spread or variation of a variable about the central value. When a value is very close to the central value, those are measures of central tendency. How much variation is known as the dispersion. So various measures of dispersions are range, various, standard deviation, coefficient of variation. So range is the simplest method, which is defined as difference between the value of largest item and values of smallest item. And mean deviation, it is the average of deviation from the arithmetic mean. So single value, how much it deviates from a mean. But when we calculate this arithmetic mean and mean deviation, it will be in a negative representation. But in the mathematics, negative representations are not usually accepted. So to overcome this, we have found the standard deviation, where we will do the squaring and square rooting. So this will cancel the negative arithmetic mean. As I have already said, this is a squaring and square rooting of mean deviation. And then coefficient of variation, it is a measure used to compare a relative variability, which is standard deviation by mean into 100. So test of significance, we have collected the data, analyzed the data, and we got some result. But to do the analysis, we have to know what test to be applied to the data. So when different samples are drawn from the same population, estimates might differ. So this difference is the estimates is called sampling variability. So first we have to do hypothesis testing. In the context of testing hypothesis, there are basically two types of error which will commonly happen. Type 1 and type 2 error. Type 1 error is when we reject the null hypothesis. Null hypothesis is there is no difference between the two variables which we are finding. So when we reject it, when it is true, it will not hamper a result that much, but the type 1 error is of 5%. So that is why we will represent as alpha error as 0.05. While type 2 error, when we accept the null hypothesis. When we know the null hypothesis is wrong and accepting it, which is actually a big impacting on the results. So that is known as beta error. and it is directly or indirectly proportional to the power of the study, which is 1 minus beta, and allowable beta error is 20%. So to test these hypotheses, we have various analysis. First, parametric and non-parametric test, which means when we have a data, we have to find if the data is normally distributed or not. As we have seen in the Gaussian curve or a normal curve, first we have to plot the data in that graph and find if it is normal or non-normal. When the data is normal, we will go for parametric test. When the data is non-normal, we will go for non-parametric test. So first we have quantitative data and qualitative data. Majority of the quantitative data will go for parametric test, and qualitative data will always go for non-parametric test. So when it is quantitative and we have to compare between two groups, we have to employ independent t-test, and the non-parametric representative is known as Mann-Whitney U-test. And when we have to find the difference in the one group from one point of time to the second point of time, like pre and post, so that is known as paired t-test. And the non-parametric alternative is Wilcoxon sign rank test. And we have more than two groups. In that case, we can employ one-way ANOVA, and we have too many time points. We have 3 time points, 4 time points, like first month, third month, 6 months, 9 months. In that case, we can go for repeated measures ANOVA. And one-way ANOVA's replacement for non-parametric test is Kruskal-Wallis test. And for qualitative data, we have chi-square test, and when the data is very small, when it is less than 30 samples, we will go for McNemar's test. So as I have already said, based on the type of data, we will go for the hypothesis testing. The types of data can be categorical or numerical, which is nothing but qualitative or quantitative, and qualitative between two groups, non-paired, and more than two groups, chi-square test. Numerical or quantitative, when it is normally distributed, we go for all the parametric test as I mentioned, and non-normal or skewed distribution, we will go for the alternative non-parametric test. So coming to the correlation coefficient, this is also a hypothesis testing wherein we will not give an exact result. So this is just a relationship between one variable and the other variable. So correlation is the relationship between two sets of variable. The magnitude or degree of relationship between two variable is called as correlation coefficient, represented by V. It can vary from -1 to +1, and the mid value is 0. 0 means there is no correlation between the two variable. -1 means when the one variable increase, the other variable decrease. +1 means when the one variable increase, the other variable also increases. This interpretation I have mentioned, the correlation coefficient is 0 when there is no covariation. When there is a complete relationship, coefficient will be -1 or +1. So this is a graphical representation of correlation coefficient. So we found some result from our analysis. Now we have to write the report. So the basic purpose of research report is to communicate research process and observe finding with the professional community. So this is nothing but a writing process, so that we will move on to a publication. Research reports are detailed and accurate account of conduct of discipline studies accomplished to solve problem or reveal new knowledge. So this report should have general information pages, numerical page numbers should be mentioned, and all this margin and right margin have to be specified. All pages are single-sided. Text should be double spaced, and except for long quotations, there is one black line between the section heading and the text that follows. And any report, it should be easily readable font, and in a page, a font should be of minimum in number. So contents of reports: title page, table of content, chapter 1, which will include the introduction, statement of problem, purpose, significance of study, research question, hypothesis. It can be alternative and null hypothesis. Chapter 2, which will consist of background, chapter 3 consisting of methodology, chapter 4 consisting of result, chapter 5 conclusion and recommendation. And also we need the citing references, reference list, bibliography for the book writings, secondary referencings, citation, referencing styles, appendix and glossary. So this is the basic research methodology process. In subsequent sessions, we will continue with the research in each subtopics. Thank you for listening for my class.